At my grandson Noah's graduation, I learned that some families do not need to raise their voices to make you feel small. They only need a folded card, a practiced smile, and a seat with the wrong name on it. I arrived at Westfield High 40 minutes early, the way I always did for anything that mattered. I had pressed my pale blue blouse the night before, pinned on my pearl earrings, and tucked a graduation card with a check inside into my handbag. The June sun was already warm on the pavement, and the football field shimmered behind rows of white chairs lined up with careful precision. Everywhere I looked, people were hugging, taking pictures, adjusting caps, and calling out to one another with that bright kind of joy that belongs to milestone days. I stood there for a moment and let myself feel proud. Noah had worked hard for this. I had watched him grow from a shy little boy with untied sneakers into a young man about to step into the world. I had helped with school supplies, tutoring, SAT prep, and later the deposit for his freshman housing. None of that felt like sacrifice to me. It felt like family. Daniel spotted me near the entrance and lifted a hand, but he did not come over. My son had developed that habit over the years, acknowledging me from a distance as if closeness might complicate something. Melissa stood beside him in a cream dress and oversized sunglasses, speaking to another parent with the same polished smile she used whenever she wanted to look gracious without having to be kind. I told myself not to read into it. I told myself today was about Noah. An usher directed me toward the family seating section near the center aisle, and for one hopeful second, my heart softened. It looked like a good seat. A place of honor, even. I stepped between the rows, careful not to brush the programs tucked neatly onto each chair, and then I saw the card resting on the seat cushion. Family sponsor. Not grandmother. Not Evelyn Harper. Not even Mrs. Harper. Just family sponsor, printed in thick black letters as if that was my relationship to the boy crossing this stage. I stared at it long enough for the edges of the card to blur. Around me, people kept chatting, laughing, fanning themselves in the heat, but the noise seemed to drift somewhere far away. I could feel my smile still sitting on my face, though suddenly it felt heavy and strange, like something borrowed from another woman. I looked up toward Daniel and Melissa. She was already watching me. Not with surprise. Not with embarrassment. With recognition. As if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Then she gave me a tiny nod and turned back to her conversation. That was when I understood the card had not been a mistake. It was a message. A neat little label placed in public where I was meant to accept it quietly. And because I had spent most of my life protecting special occasions from ugly scenes, I did exactly what they expected. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and kept my chin high. But inside, something cold and clear began to settle into place. If they wanted the whole world to see me as a wallet with a pulse, then before this day was over, I would finally let them see what happened when that wallet closed. The ceremony began with the usual procession of black gowns, bright cords, and proud faces turned toward the stage, but I could not stop feeling the weight of those two words pressed against me like a hand on my shoulder. Family sponsor. The band played a cheerful march. Teachers guided the students into place, and all around me people leaned forward with phones raised high, eager to catch the moment their child crossed into the next chapter of life. I tried to do the same. I really did. I opened the program, found Noah's name, and traced it with my finger as if that small act might steady me. Noah Harper. Honors Society. Future business major. The letters looked handsome in print. They looked like promise. And for a few minutes, I let myself hold on to that. I remembered the first time he told me he wanted to go to college out of state. He had been 16, all nervous shoulders and hopeful eyes, sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of brochures spread between the sugar bowl and the salt shaker. Daniel had said tuition was too high. Melissa had said it would be wiser for Noah to stay local and commute. But I had seen that look in my grandson's face. The kind that only comes when a young person dares to imagine a life bigger than the one already mapped out for him. So I paid for the campus visits. I covered the testing fees. When the acceptance letter came, I mailed him a leather planner with his initials stamped on the front and a note that said, "Dream wide, then work wider." He called me crying that day, not because of the planner, but because someone had believed he could go. That memory should have warmed me. Instead, it made the card on my seat sting more sharply. I was not offended because they had noticed my support. I was offended because they had reduced me to it. They had taken every ride to tutoring, every check folded into a birthday card, Every afternoon spent proofreading scholarship essays and boiled it down to the one thing that made them most comfortable. Money. Melissa moved through the aisle during a pause in the program, graceful and polished, greeting people as though she were hosting the event herself. When she reached my row, she bent slightly and smiled without softness. "Nice seat, right?" she said. "I thought it fit. You have always been the one who keeps things afloat." Her perfume was light and expensive, floral with something sharp beneath it. I looked up at her and gave a small nod. "It is certainly memorable," I said. Her smile widened for half a second, not because she was pleased, but because she knew I had understood her. Daniel came over a moment later, hands in his pockets, already wearing the tired expression he used when he wanted peace at my expense. "Do not take it personally, Mom," he murmured. "Melissa was just trying to be funny." Funny. I looked past him toward the stage where the principal was speaking about resilience and family sacrifice. The timing nearly made me laugh. "That depends," I said quietly. Was she joking about what I mean to this family, or just saying it out loud? Daniel exhaled through his nose and glanced away. That was his answer. He did not defend me. He did not even pretend the card had been a misunderstanding. He simply returned to his section near the aisle, where he and Melissa belonged together in their neat little alliance of convenience. When Noah's row finally stood, the crowd erupted. In applause, I rose with everyone else, my heart rushing ahead of itself as he walked across the field. He looked handsome and taller than I remembered, his gown moving in the breeze, his jaw set with that nervous determination I had seen since he was a boy. When his name was called, I clapped until my palms hurt. I cheered louder than anyone around me. And for one pure second, as he smiled and lifted his diploma case for the camera, I forgot the seat card, the careful insults, the way I had been renamed in public. Then Melissa, standing 2 rows ahead, turned to a woman beside her and said in a voice just low enough to sound private and just loud enough for me to hear, "She acts like we would collapse without her. Honestly, sometimes she is more burden than blessing." The woman gave a tight little laugh, the kind people use when they do not want to disagree in public. I stopped clapping, not because my pride was hurt, though it was. Not because I was surprised, though I should have been. I stopped because at that exact moment, something in me became still, completely still. I had spent years trying to be useful enough to be loved, generous enough to be included, careful enough not to embarrass the people who embarrassed me so easily. Standing there under the hot June sun, with the applause fading around me and my grandson still smiling for photographs on the stage, I understood at last that they did not resent my help. They resented the fact that without it, the picture they liked to present to the world would start to crack. After the ceremony ended, the field dissolved into clusters of families, camera flashes, and proud conversations that floated through the warm afternoon air like confetti. Graduates spilled across the grass in black gowns and tassels, hugging relatives, posing with diplomas, laughing with the breathless relief that comes after years of early mornings and deadlines. I stood near the edge of the folding chairs, holding my handbag close against my side, watching Noah make his way through the crowd. For a moment, he was not 18 and broad-shouldered and halfway to some future city with taller buildings and colder winters. He was 6 years old again, running across my backyard in sneakers with the laces undone, holding up a spelling test with a gold star in the corner as if he had won the lottery. That was the thing about loving someone for a long time. No matter how old they became, you kept every version of them tucked somewhere inside you. Noah saw me then and smiled, real and unguarded. He came over with his diploma case still in hand and wrapped his arms around me. "You made it," he said, as if there had ever been a chance I would not. I held him a second longer than usual and kissed his cheek. "I would not have missed this for the world," I said. And I meant it. Not the polished version of the day his parents wanted displayed online. The real thing. Him. His hard work. His beginning. I handed him the envelope from my purse. He looked down at it, then back at me. "Grandma, you did not have to do that." I smiled gently. "Open it later," I said. "Today is not about the check. It is about what you earned." Melissa appeared before he could answer, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, as if even in celebration, she needed to position everyone. "There you are," she said brightly. "We are heading to Bellamy's for lunch. The Andersons are joining us, and Daniel already grabbed the reservation." Then she glanced at the envelope in Noah's hand and lifted one eyebrow. "See? This is what I mean. Your grandmother just cannot help herself. Everything has to come with a contribution. She said it playfully, almost musically, but the words landed with the same chill as the card on my seat. Noah's smile faded. Mom, he said quietly, but Melissa only laughed and adjusted the sleeve of his gown. Oh, please. I am joking. Daniel arrived a second later, carrying a bouquet someone had handed him for pictures. He looked from me to Melissa to Noah, instantly reading the strain in the air the way people do when they have lived too long inside the same rehearsed tension. Let us keep things light today, he said, not to Melissa, but to me. That was the old pattern. The one that had trained me over the years to swallow first and speak never. The one that turned every insult into my responsibility to absorb gracefully. I looked at my son for a long second and saw not cruelty exactly, but something that can do almost as much damage. Convenience. It was easier for him if I stayed dignified and silent. Easier if Melissa's sharpness was called humor and my hurt was called oversensitivity. Easier if the family machine kept running on my restraint. Noah shifted awkwardly, diploma tucked under his arm, eyes moving between us. He was old enough now to understand tone, timing, and what people revealed when they thought they could hide inside a smile. Grandma helped me more than anyone, he said, and there was no anger in his voice, only simple truth. She always showed up. Melissa's expression did not harden. That would have been too honest. Instead, it softened into something almost pitying. No one is denying that, she said. But support is one thing, Noah. Dependence is another. Your grandmother means well, but sometimes she has a way of making everything heavier than it needs to be. There it was again. Burden. Not the exact word this time, but close enough to fit the shape they had built for me. I noticed then that one of Melissa's friends was standing nearby, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Daniel cleared his throat and suggested they all head to the parking lot. Noah looked at me as if waiting for me to rescue the moment, the way I always had when family gatherings tilted off balance. But this time I did not smooth it over. I did not smile and say everyone was just emotional. I did not tuck my dignity away to protect theirs. I simply said, I will meet you there, and watched the brief confusion cross Melissa's face. Because for the first time in years, I had stopped rushing to carry a family that had become far too comfortable calling me heavy. The drive to Bellamy's took 12 minutes, but in my mind I traveled through 20 years. I followed Daniel's SUV through downtown traffic, past the hardware store where I used to buy poster board for Noah's school projects, past the diner where I took him for pancakes after parent-teacher conferences his father forgot, past the bank where I had signed more withdrawal slips for that family than I cared to count. The light turned red at Mercer and 3rd, and I sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, watching. A young couple crossed the street carrying flowers and a graduation balloon. They looked happy in the uncomplicated way people do before family turns love into accounting. I was not angry in the hot, reckless sense. Anger burns fast. What I felt was slower, clearer. It was the kind of clarity that arrives only when a pattern finally stops pretending to be coincidence. By the time I parked at the restaurant, I was no longer replaying the seat card or Melissa's polished little jabs. I was replaying years. The first was the townhouse. Daniel and Melissa had been married less than a year when they came to me with coffee shop voices and hopeful faces, explaining that they were just a little short on the down payment. Only temporary, Daniel promised. Just enough to help them get settled. I wrote the check because that is what mothers do when they still believe gratitude will live longer than need. Then there was Noah's orthodontic bill when Daniel's bonus came in lower than expected. Then the laptop his senior year because the old one had crashed and college applications were due. Then the summer business program in Chicago that Melissa called an incredible opportunity, right before asking whether I could maybe cover half. I covered all of it. Not once did I hold it over them. Not once did I attach strings. I told myself I was investing in family, in stability, in the future. But memory is a peculiar thing. Once the glass cracks, it catches light differently. Suddenly I could see all the moments I had dismissed because they were easier to forgive than confront. Melissa saying, well, thank goodness someone in this family plans ahead, whenever I paid a deposit. Daniel joking at Thanksgiving that I was the family emergency fund. Everyone laughing while I smiled and carved the turkey as if I were not being described in plain English right at my own table. Even smaller things came back to me. The way Melissa always thanked me warmly in private, but introduced my help casually in public, as though it had simply appeared from the sky. The way Daniel never corrected that version. The way I was included eagerly when bills were due and treated as intrusive when decisions were made. I entered Bellamy's a few minutes after the others and found them already gathered near the hostess stand. Noah was still in his gown, diploma tucked under his arm, looking both proud and tired. Daniel was speaking to the manager about the reservation. Melissa was laughing with the Andersons, one manicured hand resting lightly against her necklace. Every inch of her polished for the room she believed she deserved. When she saw me, she smiled with that same rehearsed brightness. "There she is," she said. "Our guest of honor finally made it. Not mother, not grandmother, not even Evelyn. Just another role, lightly spoken and carefully chosen." The hostess began leading us to a long table near the windows. Place cards sat at each setting, cream-colored and folded. For one brief second, I thought perhaps the universe had a cruel sense of humor. But my card simply said Evelyn. Clean, neutral, almost respectful. I pulled out my chair and sat down while ice water was poured and menus were passed around. The others talked over one another about photos, scholarships, dorm shopping, internships, all the bright language of beginnings. I listened quietly, but I was not absent. I was counting. Not dollars exactly, though I could have. I was counting moments. Every time I had stepped in. Every time they had leaned on me with one hand and pushed me away with the other. Every time I had mistaken being needed for being valued. When the waiter asked whether we wanted appetizers for the table, Melissa laughed and said, "Well, since we have generous company today, maybe we should celebrate properly." It was tossed out like a joke, light enough for everyone to ignore, pointed enough for everyone to understand. A few people chuckled. Daniel reached for his water glass. Noah looked down, and I finally realized something so simple it almost embarrassed me. They had been telling me who I was to them for years. Today was only the first day I had decided to believe them. The waiter brought bread, iced tea, and a little dish of whipped butter no one touched at first because everyone was still busy performing happiness. Bellamy's had that polished kind of comfort people in our town like to call upscale without sounding pretentious. Dark wood trim, tall windows, framed black and white photos of the city from decades ago. The kind of place where families took pictures over dessert and pretended nothing difficult had ever been said before. The entrees arrived. I sat halfway down the table, close enough to hear everything and far enough to see the whole arrangement clearly. Melissa had positioned herself near Noah, of course, one hand always within reach of his sleeve or shoulder, as if proximity could claim credit. Daniel sat beside her, nodding at the Andersons, smiling at the right moments, already slipping back into the version of himself that never made trouble as long as the trouble landed on someone else. Noah looked overwhelmed in the way young people do when a meaningful day starts to feel more like a performance than a memory. He had set the envelope I gave him beside his plate without opening it, which told me two things. First, that he still had some manners in a world that had become careless with mine. Second, that whatever happened next, he had no idea how much of his future had quietly been held together by hands no one at that table seemed eager to acknowledge. The menus were large and leather-bound, but hardly anyone looked at them. Melissa was too busy telling the Andersons about the school, the ranking, the speeches, the internships Noah might pursue, all with the fluid confidence of someone who preferred the story of effort to the inconvenience of remembering who had made that effort possible. "It really took all of us," she said at one point, lifting her water glass with a polished little laugh. "A village, as they say." Then she glanced at me and added, "Some villagers are more generous than others." It earned the exact reaction she wanted. A few smiles. A murmur of agreement. Enough public softness to hide the edge. I kept my hands folded in my lap and looked down at the place setting in front of me. Silverware aligned perfectly, water beading on the outside of the glass. A linen napkin folded into a clean rectangle. There was something almost comforting about objects that stayed in place when people did not. Noah's friend Tyler and his parents had joined us at the far end of the table, and I noticed the boy's mother watching the exchange with the careful expression of someone who sensed a family dynamic she did not want to touch. Good manners often look like silence from a distance. "You must be so proud," she said to me finally, kindly, perhaps trying to restore some balance to the air. "He is a wonderful young man. I am proud of who he is becoming," I said. "Not just today, For years now. Melissa smiled at that, but it was not a warm smile. It was one of those thin expressions people wear when they hear a truth they wish had less audience. The waiter returned and asked if we were ready to order. Before anyone could answer, Melissa waved a hand toward the appetizers and said, "Let us get the calamari, the crab cakes, and the truffle fries for the table. Today is special." Then, with that same airy tone she used when hiding her sharpest remarks inside charm, she added, "Besides, Evelyn never minds picking up the little extras. She likes to feel involved." There was a pause then. Small but real. Daniel stared at the menu as if the font had become unusually demanding. One of the Andersons shifted in his seat. Noah looked up so quickly his chair gave a faint scrape against the floor. "Mom," he said again, firmer this time. Melissa touched his wrist. "What?" "I am praising her generosity." That was when I saw it plainly. Not just the insult, but the method. She never struck directly. She dressed every cut as a compliment, every humiliation as inclusion. That way, if I objected, I became the difficult one, the ungrateful one, the burden. I lifted my water glass and took a slow sip, letting the cold settle me. Then I set it down with care and looked at Noah. He looked back with the open, uneasy face of a young man beginning to understand that the adults around him had not all been speaking the same language. And in that quiet second, I knew the next part mattered. Not because I needed revenge, not because I wanted a scene, but because if I stayed silent now, they would carry this version of me into his future as if it were fact. The generous grandmother, the useful checkbook, the woman who should be grateful to be invited. I had allowed that role for too long. I had mistaken patience for peace and support for belonging. As the waiter stood waiting with his pen over the order pad, I realized I was done paying for a seat at tables that only made room for my wallet. The waiter was still standing there with his patient little smile and order pad in hand when I finally looked up and said, "Separate checks." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The words were soft, clear, and steady enough to stop the table more effectively than any outburst could have. For a second, no one moved. The restaurant sounds around us went on as usual, silverware clinking, glasses touching, laughter rising from another table by the windows, but ours fell into the kind of silence that reveals more than speech ever could. Melissa blinked first. "Oh, do not be ridiculous," she said with a light laugh, as though I had made some charming little joke that needed correcting. "It is Noah's special day." I folded my napkin once, neatly, and placed it beside my plate. That is exactly why I think everyone should celebrate in a way that reflects their own contribution, I said. The waiter shifted his weight slightly, unsure whether to retreat or continue. Daniel looked as though someone had changed the rules to a game he had been winning by not noticing he was playing. "Mom," he said quietly, "this is not the time." I turned to him then, and there was something almost sad in how familiar those words sounded. It was never the time when I was expected to carry everyone else's comfort. Never the time when I was being mocked. Never the time when I was being used. Only the time, always, when the check arrived. "No," I said, still calm. "Actually, I think this is the first appropriate time in years." Noah stared at me with his brows drawn slightly together, not angry, only confused in the way people are when they have sensed tension for a long time, but are only now beginning to understand its shape. I gave him the gentlest look I could manage. None of this was his doing. Of normalcy settled something in the room. The waiter nodded gratefully and began noting the arrangement. Melissa's smile tightened at the corners. She hated losing control in front of witnesses. "I cannot imagine what has gotten into you today," she said, her voice quiet enough to sound gracious and sharp enough to cut. "After everything we have done to include you." "Include me." I nearly laughed then, but the sound would have been too cold for the room. Instead, I rested my fingertips lightly against the stem of my water glass and said, "Melissa, my seat at the ceremony did not say grandmother. It did not even say family. It said sponsor. Then you called me a burden in public and generosity in private, depending on which version made you look better. So let us not confuse inclusion with access." The words landed harder because I did not dress them up. Daniel sat back in his chair, his face drained of color in that quiet way men do when a truth they hoped would remain blurred suddenly becomes impossible to smooth over. Melissa opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, she seemed to realize charm had left her without an easy exit. Noah looked from her to me, and then down at the envelope beside his plate. He reached for it slowly, turning it over in his hands as if feeling the weight of more than paper. "Did you really choose that seat card?" he asked his mother. He did not sound accusing. That was what made it worse. He sounded disappointed. Melissa's answer came a second too late. It was meant to be playful. Noah nodded once, but it was the kind of nod that does not agree with anything. The appetizers arrived then, and suddenly the table felt absurdly full. Fried calamari, golden crab cakes, truffle fries dusted with herbs. Celebration arranged on white plates while the truth sat among us, plain and impossible to send back. I had spent years being careful not to embarrass the people who embarrassed me, years confusing silence with dignity. But dignity is not the same as disappearance. And as I watched the waiter place each dish in the center of the table, I realized I was no longer interested in being the invisible hand that made everything lovely for people who only remembered my name when something needed to be paid for. No one reached for the appetizers right away. The calamari cooled. The fries lost their steam. The crab cakes sat untouched between us like props in a play no one wanted to continue. Melissa adjusted her napkin and gave a small laugh that sounded too polished to be natural. "I think everyone is being a little dramatic," she said. It was a seat card. A joke, not a court case. Her tone was light, but I could hear the strain underneath it now, the faint crack in the finish. She had expected me to absorb the insult the way I always had, quietly and without cost to anyone but myself. Daniel still would not look directly at me. He kept his eyes on the table, on his water glass, on the menu he no longer needed, anywhere except the one place accountability was waiting. I had known that habit in him since childhood. When he was 10 and broke a neighbor's window with a baseball, he let the silence stretch until someone kinder stepped in to make it easier for him. I had been that someone then. I would not be now. Noah turned the envelope over once more in his hands, and then set it down carefully beside his plate. "Mom," he said, and there was something changed in his voice. Not louder, clearer. "Why would you put that on Grandma's seat?" Melissa gave him the patient smile mothers use when they want to sound reasonable in front of other people. "Because she paid for a lot of your school things, sweetheart." It was recognition. Noah did not smile back. "Then why not right, grandmother?" The table went still again. Even Tyler, who had been pretending to study the breadbasket, is not where this conversation is happening. The problem is what has been happening for a long time. Melissa leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other with studied ease. "And what exactly has been happening, Evelyn? We have included you in everything. We invited you today. We are sitting here celebrating as a family." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time I did not feel wounded by what she was saying. I felt finished with it. "Inviting me is not honoring me," I said. "Using me is not including me. And reducing me to what I can pay for is not family." The words did not ring through the restaurant. They did not need to. At our table, they landed with the quiet finality of a door closing. Mr. Benson lowered his gaze. His wife folded her hands together and said nothing, but I saw sympathy in her face. Tyler looked uncomfortable in the honest way teenagers do when adults stop pretending. Noah kept his eyes on me. Not embarrassed. Not defensive. Attentive. Melissa sighed and shook her head as though I were forcing her into patience she did not deserve to spend. "I think you like being needed," she said. "And when people try to stand on their own, you make it about your sacrifices." That sentence might have pierced me once. On another day, in another year, I might have gone home and examined every memory just to make sure I had not somehow invented my own hurt. But clarity had done its work. I no longer needed their version of me to make sense. "If standing on your own is what you want," I said, "then I am prepared to respect that fully." Daniel finally looked up. It was only a glance, but it was enough. Enough for him to understand there was weight behind my words. Enough for Melissa to realize the conversation was no longer decorative. Enough for Noah to sit a little straighter, as if some invisible story he had been handed all his life had begun to tear open at the seam. The waiter returned with salads, hesitated when he sensed the tension, and began setting plates down anyway, because that is what people do in restaurants and in families. They continue the service even when the mood has gone cold. But I was no longer interested in continuing anything by habit. I had spent years making myself smaller so other people could feel generous while taking from me. I had smiled through jokes, paid through slights, and accepted crumbs of respect dressed up as gratitude. Looking around that table, at the polished glasses, the folded linens, the expensive little celebration balanced on my silence, I understood that the next thing I said would not just change lunch. It would change who they thought they could keep me being. Melissa was the first to recover. She reached for her fork, cut into her salad, and said, "Prepared to respect what? Exactly." As if the conversation had drifted into something vague and theoretical instead of standing squarely in front of her with my name on it. I watched her for a moment. The careful way she lifted her glass, the controlled rhythm of her movements, the confidence of someone who had always believed she could define the room if she stayed polished enough. Then I reached into my handbag and took out a slim ivory envelope. Not the one I had given Noah. Another one. I had tucked it into my purse that morning almost absent-mindedly, the way women my age carry tissues, receipts, reading glasses, and pieces of unfinished responsibility. Inside was a business card from my attorney, folded around a single sheet of paper with notes I had written after a meeting 2 weeks earlier. A routine meeting, or so I had thought at the time. Estate review. Beneficiary updates. Simple housekeeping for the later years of life. I laid the envelope beside my bread plate and looked at Daniel first. "For the past 6 years," I said, "I have helped with your mortgage shortfall, Noah's orthodontist, his college visits, his laptop, his housing deposit, and more little emergencies than I care to count. I did those things because I love my family, not because I expected applause, not because I wanted control, and certainly not because I hoped to be labeled like a corporate donor at my own grandson's graduation." Daniel's face tightened in a way I had not seen since he was young, when shame still reached him before defensiveness did. Melissa set down her fork. "No one asked you to keep score," she said. "No," I answered. "You simply assumed I never would." The truth of it seemed to travel around the table in its own quiet wave. Mr. Benson looked down at his plate. His wife reached for her napkin and refolded, a small gesture of discomfort. Tyler suddenly became fascinated by the ice in his glass. Noah did not look away. He was pale now, but steady, and I thought with a strange little ache that growing up often begins when someone else's illusion breaks in front of you. I turned toward him and softened my voice. "The envelope I gave you is yours alone. Open it when you are home. It is a check for $10,000 made out directly to you, and there is a note inside with the account number for a new education fund that only your name is attached to. Not your parents'. Not anyone else's. Yours." Noah blinked hard, stunned into silence. Melissa straightened so quickly her chair gave a faint scrape against the floor. "Excuse me," she said. There it was. Not gratitude. Not surprise for his sake. Immediate alarm over access. I met her gaze without blinking. "You heard me." Daniel leaned forward. "Mom, that is not necessary. We can manage things together." Together. The word might have been laughable if it were not so tired. "That is precisely what I am changing," I said. "From this point on, I will not be managing anything together with people who call me a burden while benefiting from my help. I will support Noah directly when I choose to. I will not be funding your household, your extras, your celebrations, or your conveniences. And next week, I will be meeting with my attorney again to update the remainder of my estate accordingly." The color left Melissa's face in a way no cosmetics could fix. Daniel stared at me as though I had spoken in a language he used to know and no longer did. "You cannot be serious," Melissa said. Her voice was low now, no longer polished, no longer playful. "Over one misunderstanding." I folded my hands in my lap and gave her the calmest answer I had ever given anyone. "This is not about one seat card. It is about years of being valued only when I was useful. Today was simply the day you said the quiet part in public." Noah looked down at the unopened envelope, then back at his parents, and something in his face closed. Not his heart, perhaps, but his innocence. I did not enjoy that. I took no pleasure in any of it. But pleasure was never the point. Truth was. And as the waiter returned to ask whether anyone wanted dessert, I realized I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because I had taken anything from them. Because at last, I had stopped offering myself to people who treated my love like a line item. Dessert menus remained unopened. The waiter stood there for one uncertain second, pen poised above his pad, and I spared him by saying, "Just coffee for me, please. Black." It was such an ordinary order, but it seemed to steady the room by reminding everyone that the world had not ended simply because I had stopped pretending. The others declined dessert in a scattered chorus. No one wanted cheesecake after truth. The waiter disappeared, and the silence that followed felt different from the earlier ones. Less shocked, more exposed. Melissa sat perfectly still now, her hands resting beside her plate with a stiffness she would have called poise if anyone asked. Daniel looked older than he had that morning. Not older in the face exactly, but in the shoulders. Like a man who had finally realized that passive choices still count as choices, and that years of looking away do not make a person innocent. Noah kept one hand on the envelope near his plate, almost protectively, and I noticed that he was no longer leaning toward either of his parents. It was only an inch or two of distance, but family truths often begin there, in the small spaces people suddenly stop crossing. When my coffee arrived, I thanked the waiter, added a little cream, and stirred it slowly. The spoon against the cup sounded clear in the hush. I took one sip and then looked at Noah. "You do not owe me gratitude for becoming who you are," I said. "You only owe yourself honesty about the people around you." He swallowed hard and nodded once. "Grandma," he said, his voice quieter than before. I did not know. I believed him. That was the mercy in all of this. Whatever had been built around him, he had not built it. "I know," I said. "That is why I am telling the truth now, instead of later." Melissa shifted then and found enough of her voice to speak. "You are making this into something cruel," she said. On his day, it was almost impressive, the way she could still reach for blame as if it were a shawl she had every right to wear. I set my cup down carefully. "No," I said. "Cruel would have been letting him grow up believing that disrespect is acceptable as long as it arrives dressed as humor." Daniel shut his eyes for a brief second. Then he opened them and finally did what I had waited years for him to do. He looked directly at me. "Mom," he said, and there was no irritation in it this time, only a worn kind of regret. I should have said something sooner. I held his gaze, not warmly, not coldly, just truthfully. "Yes," I said. "You should have." There was nothing else to add. Some apologies arrived too late to fix the thing itself, but not too late to reveal character. Whether he would do anything with that revelation was no longer mine to manage. The bill came on a silver tray with separate checks exactly as requested. I paid mine, left a generous tip, and stood before anyone else had fully decided what posture this ending required. Noah rose too. For a moment I thought he might try to hug me in front of everyone, but instead he stepped closer and said, very softly, "I will call you tonight." It was not dramatic. It was not a promise made for the room. It was better than that. It was sincere. I touched his cheek for just a second. "Take your time," I told him. "Read the note first." Then I picked up my handbag and turned to leave. As I passed Melissa, she said my name, not sharply, not sweetly, just uncertainly, as though she were speaking to someone she had misjudged and could no longer quite place. I paused but did not turn back fully. "If I am such a burden," I said, "you will have to learn how heavy life feels without me carrying part of it." I walked out before anyone answered. Outside, the late afternoon sun had softened into gold, and the town looked almost gentle again. Cars moved along Main Street. A flag stirred above the courthouse. Somewhere down the block, a group of graduates laughed too loudly outside an ice cream shop, already stepping into their next chapter without looking behind them. I stood there for a moment beside my car, breathing in warm air that smelled faintly of summer and pavement, and I realized I did not feel abandoned. I felt returned to myself. There is a particular peace that comes when you stop begging to be valued by people who have only ever measured your usefulness. I had not lost my family that afternoon. I had lost an illusion. And as I drove home with the windows cracked and the sky beginning to blush toward evening, that felt less like grief than freedom.